Blessed are you, O Yahweh, our God, King of the universe. Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and will not be afraid. For Yahweh God is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation, and you will say in that day, give thanks to Yahweh, call upon his name, make known his deeds among the peoples, proclaim that his name is exalted.
Imagine standing in Jerusalem in 70 AD as the Roman legions close in on the temple. The very heart of Jewish worship is about to fall. Yeshua had warned his disciples, "When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, flee Judea." In this video, we examine the most fitting historical fulfillment of that prophecy, the First Jewish-Roman War, and the destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple by the Romans under Titus. We'll walk through the chilling events: the Zealot uprising, Cestius Gallus surrounding the city with Roman ensigns bearing the idolatrous eagle standard, the believers miraculously fleeing to Pella just as prophesied, and Titus's final siege, complete with pagan sacrifices offered on the temple grounds. This wasn't just random history. It was the dramatic fulfillment of Yeshua's words in Matthew 24. The holy city was surrounded by armies, and the abomination stood in the holy place. But here's where it gets really interesting. Did this war also fulfill the specific time prophecies in Daniel chapter 12, the 1,260, 1,290, and 1,335 days? In other words, was Daniel chapter 12, which concerns itself with, quote, the time of the end, about the events in 70 AD as preterists suggest? Or can we rule this possibility out? We'll take a careful chronological look using historical records and Josephus and precise calendar calculations to see if the numbers actually line up. And we'll find out that the abomination of desolation in Daniel chapter 12 is not about the events of 70 AD, but must correspond to a later event. Stay with me because this is a fascinating and important study that will challenge many popular interpretations about the end times. The Jewish-Roman War. The appropriate choice for the direct application of Yeshua's reference to Daniel's abomination of desolation in Matthew 24 is Daniel 9:27, in reference to the first Jewish-Roman war leading up to the siege and destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. This is fitting because the abomination is described as Jerusalem being, quote, surrounded by armies, and the instruction was to, quote, flee Judea. The one to come who would make desolate was Titus, prefect of the Praetorian Guard, and son of the emperor at the time, Vespasian. Titus destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, and it can be demonstrated that he did indeed set up an abomination. It was the Roman abomination for which Yeshua warned his disciples to look for, and then to flee to Judea. The Roman ensigns themselves were abominable to the Jews at this time, and that they were graven images of idols and false gods, notably the Roman eagle Aquila. According to Josephus, these ensigns are what the Jews would have seen approaching with the armies of Rome in 66 CE, and it were these ensigns which were set against the eastern gate of the temple in 70 CE.
And now the Romans, upon the flight of the seditious into the city, and upon the burning of the holy house itself, and of all the buildings round about it, brought their ensigns to the temple, and set them over against its eastern gate. And there did they offer sacrifices to them, and there did they make Titus imperator with the greatest acclamations of joy.
This type of sacrifice is known as the suave taurilia, here depicted.
In ancient Rome, the ritual suavitarilia was practiced, consisting in sacrificing to the god of war, Mars, a pig, sheep, and a bull. In this way, they wanted to gain his support and purify the earth. The ordinance was also performed when the temple was destroyed and a new tabernacle was to be erected in its place. Suavitarilia was carried out, for example, in 69 CE, when the capital burned down during the fight for the Roman throne. The ritual also sometimes took place before the troops set off on a serious military campaign.
Not only were pagan sacrifices of pigs, sheep, and bulls conducted on the temple grounds, but the pagan idolatrous images of the Roman ensigns literally surrounded the holy city. The beginning of the war. This first occurrence of the signs of abomination and coming desolation occurred with Cestius in November of 66 CE during the First Jewish-Roman War, which lasted from 66 to 74. This was in response to increasing tensions between Rome and the Judeans, largely instigated by Menahem ben Yehuda and Eleazar ben Yair, who were leaders of the Jewish sect of Zealots known as the Sicarii. Tensions came to a head in late summer of 66 CE, when Menahem led the Sicarii in taking over the Roman garrison at Masada and slaughtering all 700 soldiers there. At the same time, Eleazar, governor of the temple and son of Ananias the high priest, caused the cessation of all sacrifices made by Gentiles, thus signaling that the Jewish people were no longer friendly toward Gentiles, but were at war with the Romans. This occurred on approximately Tammuz 25 or August 4th of 66 CE. This is dated by Josephus as occurring sometime at least 8 days prior to the 15th of Av, likely about 20 days prior.
And this was the true beginning of our war with the Romans, for they rejected the sacrifice of Caesar on this account. And when many of the high priests and principal men besought them not to omit the sacrifice, which it was customary for them to offer for their princes, they would not be prevailed upon.
Gaius Cestius Gallus, governor of Syria, set out in autumn of 66 CE from Antioch to Jerusalem with a force of 30,000 troops. He arrived at Mount Scopus in northeast Jerusalem on Tishri 27 of 66 CE, which is November 5th, and he arrived to collect food and then advance on Jerusalem, and pitched his camp in the vicinity of the royal palace on Tishri 30. For a helpful chronological account of these events, please visit the Chronology of Cestius Gallus at the link provided below. The biblical archaeologist depicts the events as follows.
He burned and pillaged his way to Jerusalem, where the Zealots had withdrawn behind the walls of the inner city. Gallus advanced to the second wall and encamped opposite the royal palace in the upper city. For 5 days the Romans stormed the walls of the Temple Mount. On the 6th they succeeded in undermining the north wall. With victory in reach, Gallus ordered a retreat. Possibly he was bribed by Florus. Possibly he feared being caught in hostile country with winter approaching. Whatever the reasons, the decision was disastrous. Retreat swiftly became rout. Caught in the mountain passes, the Roman troops were savaged by the rebels. By the time Gallus reached Antioch, he had lost the better part of his baggage train, the war chest, the standard, and 6,000 men.
Before he left Jerusalem, he left behind 400 men to hold standards and to pretend the entire army remained.
He remained with orders to fly their colors and pretend that the whole of the army was still at Beth Horon.
The flight of believers. It was likely at this point that the believers in Messiah fled Judea to Pella, where they flourished. Eusebius provides an account of their flight.
But the people of the church in Jerusalem had been commanded by a revelation, vouchsafed to approve men there before the war, to leave the city and to dwell in a certain town of Perea called Pella, a town situated beyond the Jordan, in the north of Perea. And when those that believed in Christ had come thither from Jerusalem, then, as if the royal city of the Jews and the whole land of Judea were entirely destitute of holy men, the judgment of God at length overtook those who had committed such outrages against Christ and his apostles, and totally destroyed that generation of impious men.
The 4th century bishop Epiphanius records this.
This sect of Nazarenes is to be found in Beroia near Coelesyria, in the Decapolis near Pella, and in Bashanitis at the place called Kokhab in Hebrew, for that was its place of origin, since all the disciples had settled in Pella after their remove from Jerusalem, Christ having told them to abandon Jerusalem and withdraw from it because of the siege it was about to undergo. And they settled in Perea for this reason, and, as I said, lived their lives there. It was from this that the Nazarene sect had its origin. So Aquila, while he was in Jerusalem, also saw the disciples of the apostles flourishing the faith and working great signs, healings, and other miracles. For they were such as had come back from the city of Pella to Jerusalem, and were living there and teaching. For when the city was about to be taken and destroyed by the Romans, it was revealed in advance to all the disciples by an angel of God that they should remove from the city, as it was going to be completely destroyed. They sojourned as emigrants in Pella, the city above mentioned in Transjordania. And this city is said to be of the Decapolis. But after the destruction of Jerusalem, when they had returned to Jerusalem, as I have said, they wrought great signs.
Following Cestius's defeat and the flight of the believers known as Netzarim, Emperor Nero sent General Vespasian in 67 CE to crush the rebellion beginning in the northern region in the Galilee. He was joined by his son Titus. They set their eyes on Judea in the spring of 68. In 69, Vespasian was enthroned as emperor, and he dispatched his son Titus from Alexandria to take care of the Jewish revolt in Jerusalem. Titus begins his march toward Jerusalem in early 70 CE. The siege. According to historians, hostilities began to intensify by the spring of 70, leading up to Passover. Titus began his siege of Jerusalem on Nisan 22, or Xanthicus 22, which was approximately April 22nd of 70 CE. The outermost wall breaks on ER 7, May 7. He breached the city's middle walls 5 days later on ER 12, but was pushed back. The wall is raised 4 days later on ER 16, approximately May 16th of 70 CE. The daily sacrifice was taken away on the 17th of Tammuz, or Panemus, which was approximately the 14th of July.
And now Titus gave orders to his soldiers that were with him to dig up the foundations of the tower of Antonia, and make a ready passage for his army to come up, while he himself had Josephus brought to him. For he had been informed that on that very day, which was the 17th day of Panemus, the sacrifice called the daily sacrifice had failed, and had not been offered to God for want of men to offer it, and that the people were grievously troubled at it.
3 weeks later, the temple was set ablaze on the 10th of Av, approximately August 6th, 70 CE. Titus's abominable ensigns were set against the eastern gate of the temple, and pagan sacrifices were made upon them. Thus, the Abomination of Desolation was seen standing in the holy place. Finally, the entire city was taken 4 weeks later on the 8th of Elul, approximately September 2nd, 70 CE.
And thus was Jerusalem taken, in the 2nd year of the reign of Vespasian, on the 8th day of the month Gorpius Elo, AD 70. It had been taken 5 times before, though this was the 2nd time of its desolation. And thus ended the siege of Jerusalem.
The First Jewish-Roman War did not end, however, until Masada was taken on Nisan 15, approximately May 1st of 74 CE. Another helpful online resource by G. J. Goldberg is Chronology of the War According to Josephus, Part 7, which can be found at the following link. Titus represented the Roman Empire, the known world of the time. The real ruler of the world was Satan, according to John 12:31, who is known as the ancient serpent in Revelation 12:9. Satan's attempt to destroy Messiah, which is symbolized in Revelation 12:4, was an abomination. He tried first with Herod, and then appeared to succeed at the crucifixion. But his sinister plans were thwarted by the resurrected Messiah. Judah's denial of Messiah was also the work of Satan through the hands of the unrepentant Judean religious elite who loved the pleasures of riches under the auspices of their Roman-procured civil dominance more than the truth of God. This all led to the desolation of Jerusalem that began in 70 CE. We are still living in the time of Jerusalem's desolation and the time of the Gentiles.
They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive into all the nations. And Jerusalem will be trodden down by the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Luke 21 verse 24.
The completion of the time of Jerusalem's desolation doesn't occur until the fulfillment of all of the events of Revelation up to chapter 20, including the seals, trumpets, and bowls. These are detailed extensively in the 2nd installment of this book series, entitled The Greater Apocalypse, a Historicist Guide to Revelation. Did the siege fulfill Daniel 12?
And from the time the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation set up, there will be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and reaches the end of the 1,335 days. Daniel 12 verses 11 to 12.
Preterists often attribute the fulfillment of the 1,290 and 1,335 days of Daniel chapter 12 to the Jewish-Roman War and the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. After all, if the second coming of Messiah occurred during or following the war, then the time prophecies given in Daniel 12 relating to the daily sacrifices and the abomination of desolation must be attributed to the chronology of Titus's siege of Jerusalem. Full preterists believe that the consummate resurrection of the dead occurred during this time, albeit a symbolic corporate resurrection of Israel and a release of the righteous dead from Hades. There is no future resurrection, and the 1,260, 1,290, and 1,335 days were fulfilled in 70 CE.
The one second coming, or the parousia, of Christ attended with the one judgment and resurrection of the living and dead was a process from AD 30 to AD 70 for Israel coming out of her old covenant world or body and into her new covenant world or body, was spiritual, corporate, resulting in the souls of men such as Daniel being raised out of Hades or Abraham's bosom to close the old covenant age in AD 70.
Partial preterists believe that a symbolic corporate resurrection occurred in 70 CE, but the consummate resurrection is envisioned by John as a future event. The 1,260, 1,290, and 1,335 days were fulfilled in 70 CE as a type and pattern of the consummate resurrection which John envisioned.
Does Daniel teach that the eschatological, consummate resurrection occurs during the Great Tribulation in AD 70? No, he does not. Daniel sees in chapter 12 verses 5 to 7 an image that forms the pattern of John's vision in Revelation 10 verse 5. A man, or angel, standing above the waters uttering an oath to the eternal God. He promises that the events of Israel's end will be finished, transpiring within a period of a time, times, and half a time. This apparently signifies a period of 1 year, 2 years, and half a year, which is John's 3½ years or 42 months. So the resurrection in Daniel 12 does not associate the consummate resurrection with the AD 70 tribulation. Daniel only picks up on resurrection imagery and, like Ezekiel, applies that to corporate Israel. He is teaching that in the events of AD 70, the true Israel will arise from old Israel's carcass, as in a resurrection.
Material preterists, also known as Satan's little season theory, believe that the consummate resurrection occurred in approximately either 70 or 73 CE, just following a period of 3½ years of tribulation corresponding to the 1,260 days of Daniel 12 and Revelation 11, 2-3, and chapter 12, 6, and 14. This corresponds to the Jewish-Roman War of the 1st century, with emphasis on the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE.
Working on the basis that Jesus has already returned, just like he said he would, the tribulation, resurrection of the saints and most of the events of Revelation will have already happened, coinciding with the destruction of the temple and return of Jesus. The vile judgments will have already been poured out on the world, during what was literally the end times or end of the age as spoken of by Jesus, and imminently expected by the apostles, and all believers at the time.
As the onion is peeled back, we see that the earth is flat, that reality is malleable, and most churches are indoctrinated religious institutions that bow to the evil government. And if that weren't enough, I am here to propose to you that our historical timeline has been altered by 700 to 1,000 years in an effort to conceal the theory that Jesus' second coming occurred at approximately 70 AD and reigned with the saints for 1,000 years in the period known as the millennium. So, if John was to remain until his coming, and secular history is correct that Jerusalem fell in 70 AD, then John was changed in an instant, and raptured to meet the Lord in the air, most likely from 68 to 70 AD.
A historicist approach. In this segment, I would like to review the sequence of events surrounding the Jewish-Roman War in closer chronological detail in order to prove that it does not line up with the prophecies in Daniel chapter 12. According to Stellarium astronomical software, the vernal equinox occurred on the 22nd of March in 70 CE at 5:44 p.m. The first day of the first Hebrew month occurs just after the conjunction of the moon on its first visible light trigger or crescent, on or following the day of the vernal equinox. This occurred on the evening of March 31st, with the moon illuminated at 1%. Because the Hebrew day begins in the evening, the first Hebrew day occurred from the evening of March 31st to the evening of April 1st. For clarity, I'll simply refer to April 1st as the first day of the Hebrew year in 70 CE. In other words, April 1st is the same as Nisan 1. Now that we can equate Nisan 1 with April 1st, we can accurately provide the proleptic Gregorian date for the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem, which was recorded to be Nisan 22. By counting forward 21 days from Nisan 1 or April 1st to the siege on Nisan 22, we arrive at April 22nd. I used this same method to date each event in the chart provided. Relevant new moon dates for 70 CE are provided in this following chart. New moon dates for 70 CE. Nisan 1 is April 1st, and it had a 30-day month. ER 1 was May 1st. It had a 29-day month. Sivan 1 was May 30th. This had a 29-day month. Tammuz 1 was June 28. This had a 30-day month. Av 1 was July 28, and this had a 29-day month. Elul 1 was August 26th. For 66 CE, the vernal equinox occurred on March 22nd at 6:30 p.m. The first visible crescent of the moon was visible on the evening of April 14th, marking April 15th as Nisan 1. The new moon corresponding to Tishri occurred on the evening of October 9th, marking October 10th as Tishri 1. Therefore, Tishri 27 corresponds to November 5th, the date Cestius raised his abominable ensigns, marking Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. For 74 CE, the vernal equinox occurred on March 22nd at 4:44 p.m. The first visible crescent of a new moon following the vernal equinox occurred in the evening of April 16th, making April 17th Nisan 1. This makes the end of the siege of Masada and the end of the First Jewish War on Nisan 15 equivalent to May 1st of 74 CE. By inputting these Gregorian dates into the days calculator, days between two dates, found at timeanddate.com, I've acquired the days, months, and years between each significant date and kept track of the total amount of time elapsed as well. I've then analyzed these intervals to determine if there is a possible match with the time frames given in Daniel chapter 12. The following chart will take you through the major events of the Jewish-Roman War as they pertain to any potential fulfillment of the chronology of Daniel 12. The time interval column displays the total days between each event in the top row and the calendrical years, months, and days between each event in the bottom row. The time elapsed column displays the total consecutive days transpired since the beginning of the war in the top row and the calendrical years, months, and days in the bottom row. I created this chart to be able to objectively assess whether the 1,260, 1,290, and 1,335 days could fit between any of the significant events of the war. In other words, we're doing our due diligence to see if this prophecy actually fits the events of 70 CE. The Jewish-Roman War prophetic timeline. The first event was when Masada was taken by the Sicarii. Eleazar forbids Gentiles from making sacrifices, and this began the Jewish-Roman War. This occurred on Tammuz 25 or August 4th of 66 CE. Now, the time interval reads 0 and time elapsed is 0 because this is the starting point. Then we get to Cestius' arrival. The abominable ensigns are set up, and the believers flee to Pella. This occurred on Tishri 27, which is November 5th. So thus far, 93 days have elapsed, 3 months and 1 day. Then we get to Titus beginning the siege of Jerusalem on Nisan 22nd or April 22nd in 70 CE. So at this point, a few years later, we're at 1,264 days. It's been 3 years, 5 months, and 17 days of a time interval since the last event. And we've totaled 1,357 days since the beginning. This equates to 3 years, 8 months, and 18 days. When the outer walls were breached on ER 7 or May 7th, this was 15 days later, totaling 1,372 days, or 3 years, 9 months, and 3 days. When the middle walls were breached on ER 16 or May 16, this was 9 days later, and totaling 1,381 days, or 3 years, 9 months, and 12 days. When the daily sacrifice was halted on Tammuz 17 or July 14th, 59 days later, or 1 month and 28 days later, the total time elapsed was 1,440 days, or 3 years, 11 months, and 10 days. And then when the temple was set ablaze and the Abomination of Desolation was set up on the eastern gate of the temple, this occurred on Av 10 or August 6th. This was 23 days after the daily sacrifice was halted, totaling 1,463 days, or 4 years and 2 days. Finally, the city was set ablaze, the temple demolished, and the siege was ended on Elul 8th, or September 2nd, 27 days later, totaling 1,490 days, or 4 years and 29 days. And then we go forward all the way to the end of the war when Masada was overrun, and this occurred on Nisan 15, or May 1st of 74. And this was 1,337 days after the city was set ablaze, or 3 years, 7 months, and 29 days, bringing the total amount of time elapsed for this war to 2,827 days, or 7 years, 8 months, and 27 days. So what are we looking for? The prophetic components of Daniel chapter 12 apply to an abomination of desolation that occurs after the time of Antiochus IV. They pertain to the period of the fourth beast kingdom, Rome. One then naturally asks the question, did these 1,260, 1,290, and 1,335 days apply to the Jewish-Roman War in 70 CE? Well, if we are to apply the time, times, and half a time, and the 1,290 and 1,335 days of Daniel 12 to the desolation in 70 CE, then we must be able to identify a period of 1,260 days, or time, and times, at the end of which the power of the holy people is considered to be finally shattered. We must also identify 1,290 days in relation to the daily sacrifice being taken away and the setting up of the abomination of desolation, according to Daniel 12:11. And third, we must identify an important blessing after the 1,335 days, according to verse 12. The Hebrew lunisolar calendar and the prophetic 360-day year. Before delving into counting days, months, and years, it is important to discuss the calendar of the Jewish people. I rely heavily on the work of Herb Selinsky in his treatise on the biblical calendar, which can be found at the following link. The Hebrew calendar is a lunisolar calendar, meaning it relies upon the movements and positions of both the moon and the sun. A lunar year is roughly 354 days long, but every 2 or 3 years an extra month, known as a second month of Adar or Adar II, is added to the end of the year, just before the spring equinox, in order to synchronize it with the solar year, and this is called intercalation. Debate exists on how exactly intercalation was determined. However, Selinsky remarks that a month can either be 29 or 30 days, and the first month of the year begins on the first visible lunar crescent on or following the vernal equinox. Intercalation occurs cyclically in what became known as the Metonic cycle. After 19 years, the solar and lunar years line up precisely, and the Metonic cycle of adding an extra month every 2 or 3 years starts over. The cycle is as follows. You'll add an extra month in years 3, 6, 8, 11, 14, 17, and 19 of each 19-year cycle, and then you repeat this cycle. When one is measuring short term, such as with a few years at a time, it is important to take into account intercalary months and the Metonic cycle. For the purpose of determining the timing of events within a period of 1,260 days, it would normally be important to include intercalary months in our calculations. However, we see evidence in Scripture that prophetic timeframes are not always provided with intercalation in mind. For example, intercalation was used in describing the amount of time that Ezekiel spent lying on his side in Ezekiel chapters 1 through 8. There was a total of 437 days which had transpired over the course of a maximum of 14 calendar months' time. Now this is impossible using a 365-day year with 12 months per year. because 365 plus 31 plus 31 equals 427. And this figure is 10 days too short. We're supposed to add up to a total of 437 days. But it is easily accomplished using a lunisolar year of 354 days and adding one intercalary month. The math is as follows: 354 plus 30 plus 30 plus 30 equals 444. This figure meets the minimum requirement of days, which was 437, within a maximum of 14 calendar months, and it meets this requirement by 7 days. The account of the flood, however, introduces a major prophetic timekeeping concept, which I refer to as the standard 30-day prophetic month. This concept proposes that when prophetic passages provide time frames with regard to future events, months are composed of 30 days, and intercalation of the year is disregarded. This is helpful for the timing of events for which the heavenly timepieces cannot be observed, and therefore the exact number of days in a given month are impossible to decipher. For example, the times given for the flood were 150 days, found in Genesis 7:24, and 5 months in Genesis 7:11 and 8:4. This adds up to 5 30-day months. Even though we know that a month can consist of between 29 and 30 days, it can never have more than 30. Therefore, the 30-day month becomes the standard unit of measurement when the moon is not visible. Some theorize, however, that Noah was using an ancient Egyptian calendar which consisted of 12 30-day months plus an intercalary month consisting of 5 epigomenal days, which were treated as outside the year proper. Because the year is about a quarter of a day too short, this calendar lost about 1 day every 4 years, and thus drifted over time relative to the true solar year. I highly doubt that Noah was referring to an ancient Egyptian calendar. This concept of using 30-day months is also employed with the 42 months of Revelation 11:2 being the same as the 1,260 days in Revelation 11:3. This is because 1,260 days adds up to exactly 42 months of 30-day months. Being that Revelation was written by a first-century Jew who was not utilizing the ancient Egyptian calendar, demonstrates that it is not necessary to suppose that Noah was using the Egyptian calendar. With this in mind, we should evaluate what the time frames given in Daniel 12 actually represent quantitatively.
How long until the fulfillment of these wonders? It will be for a time and times and half a time. When the power of the holy people has finally been shattered, all these things will be completed. And from the time the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation set up, there will be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and reaches the end of the 1,335 days. Daniel 12:6-7 and 11-12.
Time, times, and half a time. Revelation 12:6 and 12:14 demonstrate that a time in Scripture refers to a year. We can also look to the example of Nebuchadnezzar's insanity in Daniel 4:24-34, which is said to have lasted for 7 times, long enough for him to have grown nails like the claws of a bird and hair like the feathers of an eagle, and therefore longer than 7 days, but fitting for 7 years. Therefore, a time, times, and half a time equates to approximately 3.5 years. Being that a prophetic month consists of 30 days, we may then assume that 1,290 days equates to simply 3.5 years and 1 month. The 1,335 days equates to 3.5 years plus 2.5 months. Complexity arises when attempting to determine how much calendrical time 3.5 years truly equates to. This is because there are generally 2 ways to calculate a year. 1. The Gregorian solar year, which is 365.24219 days. There are always 12 months in a year, and therefore 3.5 solar years are always 3 years and 6 months, totaling 42 months. So 3.5 solar years is technically 1,278.35 days, not 1,260. 2. The Hebrew or Babylonian lunar year. This equals 354.36707 days on average. The length of each month varies from 29 to 30 days. The length of the month is determined visually and cannot be anticipated in advance. An intercalary month is added every 2 or 3 years, according to the Metonic cycle, so there is always one intercalary month, or second Adar, added within a time frame of 3 years. Therefore, this time frame of 3.5 years would equate to 43 months, with one of the months being a second Adar. Thus, only 42 calendrical months have passed. The average lunar month is 29.53059 days. Therefore, 43 lunar months equates to 1,269.81 days, not 1,260. Neither method matches exactly 1,260 days for a period of 3.5 times or years. Therefore, it appears most appropriate to simply assert that the standard 30-day prophetic month is being employed as a simple method to symbolically designate how much calendrical time will transpire, regardless of the technical amount of days in each month and the amount of months in each year during the time in view. In other words, the use of time periods easily divisible by 30 is a clue that the standard 30-day prophetic month should be employed for the time-based prophecies given in Daniel chapter 12. Therefore, we should view the time periods mentioned as this chart shows. Prophetic time frames of Daniel 12, 6-12. The phrase time, times, and half a time equates to 3 years and 6 months in calendrical time. Calendrical time refers to the passing of calendrical months and years, rather than incorporating strict counting of days. 1,290 days equates to 3 years and 7 months, and 1,335 days equates to 3 years and 8.5 months. With these figures in mind, I have evaluated the chronology of the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE to see if these time frames could possibly match the sequence of events as some commentators assert. I grant a margin of error of 30 days in my calculations to account for minor calendrical errors, other methods of counting days, months, and years, and the possibility that the time frames given may be close approximations rather than exact figures. Let's take a look at the 3.5 years.
It will be for a time and times and half a time. When the power of the holy people has finally been shattered, all these things will be completed. Daniel 12 verse 7.
The passage connects the end of the 3.5 years, or the time, times, and half a time, to the holy people finally being shattered. Some commentators identify the time period between when Cestius set up the ensigns on November 5th of 66, and when Titus returned and began the siege against Jerusalem on April 22nd of 70, as fulfilling the time, times, and half a time. This period was 3 years, 5 months, and 17 calendar days. There were 1,264 strict days between November 5th of 66 and April 22nd of 70. This is only 4 days in excess of the allotted time of 1,260 days, but certainly falls within our reasonable margin of error of 30 days. But we must ask, does the beginning of the siege against Jerusalem really constitute the power of the holy people being, quote, finally shattered? I argue that the beginning of the siege does not qualify as a completion of the shattering of the holy people. The Jewish inhabitants of Jerusalem were still yet to suffer infighting, assassinations, famine, and even crucifixion of those trying to flee during the siege. Rather, the completion of shattering would be better identified by the Roman army breaking through all the walls of Jerusalem and completely destroying the city. This occurred another 4 months and 11 days later on September 2nd of 70. well in excess of 3.5 years. There were 1,397 strict days between November 5th of 66 and September 2nd of 70. This is 137 days in excess of the 1,260. If we consider the destruction of the city on September 2nd as the shattering, as some commentators do, then we could count back 3.5 years prior and see if there was a significant event that occurs. Counting back 3.5 years takes us to the month of Adar, or March, in 67 CE, in which nothing significant took place. Well, what if we consider the beginning of the 3.5 years to have begun the destruction of the city on the 8th of Elul, or September 2nd, and the end of the 3.5 years being the conclusion of the First Jewish-Roman War on the 15th of Nisan, or May 1st, in 74. This interval of time amounts to 3 years, 7 months, and 29 calendar days, a total of 1,337 strict days. This is 77 days in excess of 1,260. It appears that a time interval of 3.5 years does not naturally fit within any of the significant events of the First Jewish-Roman War with regard to the siege of Jerusalem, unless one considers the beginning of the siege to constitute the power of the holy people finally being shattered. It is important to note that the military power of the Jewish people was not extinguished until the end of the war in the spring of 74. 1,290 days.
From the time the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation set up, there will be 1,290 days. Daniel 12 verse 11.
1,290 days equates to 3 years and 7 months. This time period is the most important one given simply because it is so specific. 2 time markers are given: the abolishment of the daily sacrifice and the abomination of desolation. It is important to note that the passage reads as if the daily sacrifice will be abolished before the abomination of desolation is set up. Yet commentators are willing to reverse this order in order to attempt to fit the 1,290 days into the Jewish-Roman War. We have interpreted the abomination to have been Cestius's ensigns being raised on November 5th of 66 CE. Josephus also provided the exact date the daily sacrifices were abolished, which was July 14th of 70 CE. From when the abomination of desolation was displayed on November 5th of 66 to when the daily sacrifice was taken away on July 14th of 70 is a total of 3 years, 8 months, and 9 calendar days. This is 1 month and 9 calendar days too long. There were 1,347 strict days between November 5th of 66 and July 14th of 70. This is 57 days in excess of the maximum allotted time of 1,290 days, 17 days beyond our margin of error. Therefore, placing the 1,290 days between 66 and 70 CE is not a natural fit. Well, what if, rather, we interpreted the abomination of desolation to be the moment when an abominable sacrifice was set up and conducted on the eastern wing of the temple on August 6th of 70 CE? Between when the Tamid was taken away on July 14th and when the pagan sacrifice was conducted on August 6th, there were only 23 days, eliminating this interpretation as a possibility. What if, rather, we interpreted the passage to be providing a terminus a quo of the 1,290 days, beginning at the general time that the daily sacrifice was taken away and the abomination of desolation was set up? In other words, if we began the 1,290 days when the abominable sacrifice was made on August 6th, would we find a significant event at the end of this period? Well, 1,290 days from August 6th of 70 CE takes us to February 15th of 74 CE. Nothing significant occurred on this date, and the end of the war did not occur for another 74 days. So it appears that a time interval of 1,290 days does not naturally fit within any of the significant events of the First Jewish-Roman War with regard to the siege of Jerusalem. 1,335 days.
Blessed is he who waits and reaches the end of the 1,335 days. Daniel 12 verse 13.
This time period is an additional 45 days added to the end of the 1,290 days, totaling 3 years and 8.5 months. Some commentators assert that the blessing in this context would most appropriately be the end of the siege of Jerusalem. This alone is questionable because the city of Jerusalem being totally set ablaze by the Romans hardly qualifies as a blessing, even though the siege had technically ended. Thousands were murdered or taken captive as slaves, and the Jewish-Roman War didn't end until the spring of 74. From the time the daily sacrifice was taken away on July 14th or Tammuz 17, to when the siege ended on September 2nd or Elul 8, is 1 month and 19 days, 50 days total. This is 5 days in excess of the allotted 45 days. Furthermore, there were 1,397 strict days between when the abomination was revealed on November 5th of 66 and the end of the siege on September 2nd of 70. This is 62 days in excess of the allotted time of 1,335 days. Counting back 1,335 days from the end of the siege on September 2nd of 70 takes one to January 6th of 67 CE. Nothing of significance occurred on this date. During this time, Cestius was well on his way back to Antioch with what remained of the 12th Legion following a failed attempt at taking Jerusalem. The aforementioned attempts to fit the 1,260, 1,290, and 1,335 days into the Jewish-Roman War have failed this chronological evaluation. None of the given theories provide a natural and straightforward explanation of the 3 time frames. But there is yet another theory to be tested. Bible teacher and historicist Bill Weather proposes a theory that the 1,290 days pertain to the time between when the Jewish rebel leadership under Eleazar began refusing to allow Gentiles to bring offerings to the temple in the fall of 66, and when Titus began his hostilities against Jerusalem in the spring of 70. He then proposes that the 1,335 days were intended as an additional 1,335 days beyond the initial 1,290. He believes this time period was fulfilled between when the Roman armies began the siege of Jerusalem in the spring of 70 and the fall of 73, which he believes to be when Masada was captured by the Romans and the Jewish-Roman War came to an end. Weather attributes the time, times, and half a time for a period of 1,260 years not related to the Jewish-Roman War. So now I'll test this theory, beginning first with the 1,290 days. Josephus states that the true beginning of the Jewish-Roman War began when Eleazar ceased making sacrifices and offerings available to Gentiles, thus signaling that the Jewish people were no longer friendly toward Gentiles, but were at war with the Romans. Weather associates this event with the ceasing of the daily sacrifice as mentioned in Daniel 12:11. This is questionable at best because, although Gentiles were forbidden from bringing sacrifices, the regular daily sacrifice, or the Tamid specifically to Yahweh, continued until July 14th of 70 CE. The ceasing of the Gentile offerings occurred a minimum of 8 days before the 15th of Av, but perhaps, as Weather proposes, it occurred about 20 days prior. Weather dates this event as September 2nd of 66 CE. To do so, he has to assume that the month of Av in 66 began in September. He relies upon Fred Espinak's historical chart of the lunar phases for 66 CE. This chart places a new moon on September 8, meaning that if Av began in September, then it began on or after September 8. This would make the 15th of Av on September 22nd, and 20 days prior to this would fall on September 2nd. For Av to have begun in September, there must have been a second Adar in the previous Jewish year, pushing the calendar dates forward 1 month. This is because the vernal equinox occurred on March 22nd, with the next visible new moon on April 14th, making Nisan 1 occur on April 15th of 66. Av is the 5th Hebrew month, so 4 new moons from April 14th places Av on or after the new moon on August 9th, not September 8th. However, by placing a second Adar on April 14th, the month of Av gets pushed to September 8. It is possible that 66 CE was an intercalary year containing a second Adar, and it is possible that it was not an intercalary year. Because of this, we should be willing to accept a variance of 30 days in our calculations. I date the ceasing of the Gentiles' sacrifices to approximately August 4th based upon 66 not being an intercalary year. So far, so good. Weather then proposes that the Abomination of Desolation occurred exactly 1,290 days later on March 14th of 70 CE, and attributed the Abomination of Desolation to the hostilities between Titus's army and the Jews which began a few days before Passover. I can respect that determining exact dates during this time is virtually impossible because we can't be exactly sure how they reckon their months and days or how visible the new crescent moon was, which could potentially throw us off an entire month. But there is a discrepancy here that cannot be overlooked. Weather states that Passover occurred in mid-March, loosely based upon NASA's recording of the full moon occurring on March 15th. However, Passover occurs no sooner than a minimum of 14 days following the vernal equinox. Otherwise, it would occur in winter. The vernal equinox occurred on the 22nd of March in 70 CE. Therefore, weather's date of March 14th occurring a few days before Passover does not fit the astronomy. It would have been at least 22 days prior to Passover, and in my calculation, it would have been exactly 1 month prior to Passover, which I dated to April 14th. Further, I am aware that many traditionally date the beginning of the siege to a few days before Passover. Even the Wikipedia article on the siege of Jerusalem says that the siege began 3 days before Passover, and references the respected historian Peter Schaeffer. Schaeffer might be where everyone gets this information and just assumes it to be correct. But Josephus dates the beginning of the siege not to a few days before Passover, but to 15 days prior to the 7th of Iyar, which is Nisan 22nd, 8 days after Passover, or April 22nd of 70 CE. The time between Weather's initial date of the ceasing of the Gentile offerings on September 2nd of 66 CE and the beginning of the Roman siege on April 22nd of 70 CE is 1,328 days. Using my date of the ceasing of the Gentile offerings on August 4th of 66, the time between comes to 1,357 days. Neither option fits the required timing of 1,290 days. In order to make Weather's dates for the ceasing of the Gentile offerings and for the Roman hostilities, we must take significant liberty with the dating of events and ignore important calendrical rules for determining the start of a new Hebrew year. Now, let's examine Weather's proposal for the 1,335 days. Weather proposes that this time was fulfilled from his date for the Abomination of Desolation on March 14th of 70 CE until the end of the siege of Masada, which he dates to November 8th of 73 CE, exactly 1,335 days. He rightly demonstrates that there is evidence in the Masada papyri discovered in 1963 contradicting the traditional dating for the end of the siege of Masada having occurred in the spring of 73. However, this very same evidence points to the end of the siege occurring in the spring of 74 and not 73. Josephus records that it ended on the 15th of Xanthicus or Nisan, which isn't until the springtime. Therefore, the siege of Masada ended in the spring of 74 on the 15th of Xanthicus. I have calculated this to be May 1st of 74 CE. If one counts back 1,335 days from May 1st of 74, Then one arrives at September 4th of 70. This happens to be 2 days after I've calculated the end of the siege and the destruction of Jerusalem on Elul 8 or September 2nd. So it is possible we could count the 1,335 days from when the city was set ablaze if we're willing to accept that the destruction of Jerusalem was the Abomination of Desolation. But we would then have to revise Weather's date for the ceasing of the daily sacrifice, which he had initially placed on September 2nd of 66. If one counts back 1,290 days from when the city was set ablaze, one arrives at September 2nd of 67, a full year in excess of Weather's initial date. Further, I'm not aware of anything significant occurring on that date, much less anything pertaining to the ceasing of a daily offering. When I presented this information to Mr. Weather, he explained that he believes that either Book 7 of Josephus's War of the Jews was an error, or that the account of Masada was subject to fabrication or edits. This means that Weather is not truly relying upon a primary historical source from which to test his dating schema, but rather is presupposing that his interpretation is correct and then claiming that the available historical accounts are unreliable where they do not support his presupposition. To his credit, however, there is evidence to suggest that Josephus's account of the siege of Masada may be unreliable. I conclude that a thorough evaluation of the chronological evidence leads one to the conclusion that Weather's hypothesis, although creative and brilliant, does not stand up to scrutiny. There is no clear historical or archaeological evidence to validate his given interpretations for the timelines. I believe his proposal, which says that the ceasing of the daily should be interpreted not as the removal of the tamid or the daily offering to Yahweh, but should be interpreted as the banishment of Gentile offerings, I believe this proposal is a departure from sound hermeneutics and authorial intent. His proposal that the 1,335 days serve as an additional time period separate from the 1,290 is also a departure from the natural reading of the text, which seems to suggest that the 1,290 and 1,335 are referring to the same terminus a quo. I respect Mr. Weather's work here, however, I must relegate his proposal to the realm of conjecture. In conclusion, the hypothesis that the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE fulfills the time frames given in Daniel chapter 12 fails a thorough historical chronological evaluation. Preterists truly have no historical ground to stand upon to justify this idea that the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE fulfilled the time frames in Daniel 12. Therefore, we must understand the time frames of Daniel 12 apply to a future fulfillment. This is covered extensively in chapter 17 in the segment entitled 1,290 and 1,335 Days. We'll have a future video on this, and we're going to cover the 1,290 and 1,335 days and their fulfillment in relation to the Roman Catholic papacy. So you're going to have to stay tuned and hang around for that one. History shows that Yeshua's warning was fulfilled with stunning precision. The Roman armies surrounded Jerusalem. The abomination stood in the holy place, and the believers escaped to Pella, just as he said. We've determined that the 1,260, 1,290, and 1,335 days were not fulfilled in the Roman siege of 70 AD, and in future videos, we'll identify how these were historically fulfilled in the office of the papacy. But you'll have to wait for that, because in the next episode, we will begin our dive into the Passion Week. The very week that Yeshua made his painful journey from Jerusalem to the cross, from the cross to Sheol, and from Sheol to his resurrection and ascension. We'll cover topics including the sign of Jonah, the Quartodeciman controversy, the triumphal entry, how the biblical calendar is calculated, and the precise astronomical harmonization of the date of Passover in 30 AD, and so much more. If you've enjoyed this study, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Let me know. Do you see 70 AD as the complete fulfillment of Daniel 12, or do you think it was meant for a later time? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Shalom.